What happens when a Las Vegas Reformed Jewish rabbi and a Las Vegas Presbyterian pastor have a conversation as friends? They discover that no matter where you live or what you believe, faith matters. In this episode of Faith Matters, Rabbi Sanford Akselrad from congregation near Tamid and Reverend Adrian from Green Valley Presbyterian Church talk about healing and the power of prayer. Does suffering have meaning? Should one always have a sense of hope? And why you should always remember the goodness of God. All this and more in this episode of Faith Matters.
Well, welcome everyone to another episode of Faith Matters. Thank you so much for tuning in. Adrian, it's good to see you again.
Hey, it's good to see you, Sandy.
All right.
Better?
Yeah, I'm feeling better, and I don't want to really belabor it, but the last episode we did talk a little bit about, our religious traditions and what it meant to be sick, and how someone who's sick might wonder what their relationship is with God, and what it meant to be a friend when someone was ill. I thought it would be interesting to kind of do this as a part two, and that is the role of religion in our healing. And I'm sure as we talked, it's going to go in different directions. But I want to think back to something that occurred to me as a younger rabbi about 25 years ago. I went to a convention, and it was in California. And one of the congregations developed the idea of a healing service, which today seems like, of course we do healing services, but in the Jewish tradition, that was seen as something more Christian or more other. It wasn't really something that we would do, which was to designate a specific service to healing. And this congregation created healing quilts, and it started with their sisterhood, but then other people participated. And I went home and I said, you know what? I think that's great for our congregation. Let's do a healing service. And I didn't know what to expect. And now we've been doing it for 25 years, and we got all kinds of healing quilts. And for me, that has always been our most powerful service, because we get 100, 200 people, and I take off the tie and the jacket, and we have some very tender music, and it is a time in which we reach out to God and we say, God, please heal me now. And it's a reminder that healing is not static. It's a process. It's one thing, you go to the hospital, they fix you up, you go home, you spend a few weeks recovery, but there's a lot of chronic illnesses, and there's a lot of people who have loved ones who have illnesses for which there is no permanent cure. There are treatments, but there's not an end to the visits to the hospital or to the doctors. And so that healing service somehow brings people hope. And I was wondering, in the Christian tradition, do you have that tradition of healing services, or a moment in your regular liturgy where you ask for God's healing?
We do. And in our services during what we call the pastoral prayer, or the prayers of God's people, so in my case as pastor, I am praying for the needs of our community, the needs of our world, but I also personalize that. And we are praying for our families, our friends, our loved ones. And there is always a moment in there in our church where we are praying for healing for those who are ill, for those who are suffering, for those who are facing anxiety, depression, fear. It's not a written liturgy. It's something that I write myself. Some churches would use a written liturgy. We do have the custom in some churches of having services of healing. I think there's an interesting tension within Christian circles, as that there is a branch of Christianity of which I'm not a part, and you may have heard of this, but which would be more of the prosperity gospel, and this sense that if you are suffering, that somehow you haven't had enough faith to step out of that suffering.
Right, that goes back to the first episode where we talked
Yes.
about the reward and punishment, which, as I noted, Reform Judaism kind of rejected. But there is this biblical basis of it, and so some people take the Bible more literally. They pull that from that. But unfortunately, I've seen other religious leaders use it as, this community got an earthquake because,
Right.
or AIDS was because of this, and they just use this broad punishment of things that they think are immoral, and they assign bad things to this immorality, in which we totally reject in Reform Judaism. But I was thinking in
and you would see that as well within branches of Christianity, that we would, to be suffering is part of life. And for us as a Christian, we do believe that God entered humanity, and we believe God entered humanity in a certain way for us in Jesus. And yet we also believe that Jesus walks with us in our suffering, which is different than that. People might argue that interpretation, but it's a little bit different than that sense of prosperity gospel, which says if you have enough faith, you're going to overcome this. Well, I happen to have a loved one right now who's suffering, and the doctors have said she's probably not going to get better. Right?
Sorry.
Does that mean that she doesn't have enough faith? I remember someone said that to me once, and I kicked him out of my office, and I said, I really find that repugnant. So basically, my suffering right now is because I don't have enough faith. I'm crying out to God. And so I've seen how that theology, that ideology can really hurt someone when they're in their suffering.
I'm thinking of that famous story. I think it's a Christian in origin, so the rabbi's got to retell it, where, you got someone who's praying to God and said, God, when I was walking on the sand, I think it was, and I noticed there were times when there were two sets of footprints, and I knew you were walking with me, but when I was really hurting, I noticed there were only one set of footprints. So why did you abandon me, God? And God replies, oh, it's not that I abandoned you. It was that I was carrying you.
Yeah.
And I love that.
It's a beautiful poem, a little bit of prose, if you will, but it does give a sense of what it might be like to trust in a God who carries us, right?
Yeah. So I think it applies really to more than one religion. If you understand that even God might have a limit, but in that whole notion of carrying you, it is, I embrace you in my arms. And so maybe I don't wave a magic wand and magically you're healed, but I can be present for you. I can be present for you.
And I think for both of us in our positions as spiritual leaders of communities, that we have seen the pain that can be inflicted when you are looking at someone who is suffering because they've been diagnosed with a certain illness. And the question is, oh, were you a smoker? Oh, were you a drinker? Oh, did you do this? Well, at that moment, that's not going to change their reality. That question does absolutely nothing. So we always want to know the answer to that.
Yeah. People want to know, you as the patient, what did you do to deserve this?
Right.
And I don't know if they're looking for a blame, a cause, or, oh, wait a minute, I didn't do that, so I'm in the clear. I never know where that question comes from.
Right? An umbrella that says, oh, Adrian did this. If I don't do that, I'm not going to suffer this way. Right?
So, yeah. It's not exactly a conversation that's the same as one that you might have with your doctor. It's really a very different one when it comes from your friends or loved ones as they try to understand it. But
theologically, in the Jewish tradition, do we have what we would call in the Christian tradition the problem of pain, the problem of suffering? We don't really have an answer, right?
Right.
It's part of humanity. It's part of life. We can talk, I don't know if you use the word fallen state of creation, because of sin. But that still doesn't answer the question, when you're the one suffering, why me, right?
You know, I think I said this in the last episode, it's not just about the suffering. It says, does my suffering have meaning? But I think, part of it is, as human beings and being created in the image of God, we're still not God. It's aspirational to be like God, but we're also taught that these feelings and emotions, whether they're love or fear or faith or pain, they're part of the human experience that leads us through our vulnerabilities and carries us through to moments of courage or hope or fear. And those are moments, and I don't want to just say they're moments of testing, but in a sense they are moments of resiliency in which we're called upon the best we can to lead our lives in the highest sense. And some people can find their way through that, and others, they can get stuck because the news is just too darn difficult, or their pain is too darn tough, and all that. That's the only thing they can focus on. But in more reflective moments, that is an opportunity to reflect upon our lives and the fragility of our lives, and not necessarily say, oh, my pain was caused because I was a bad person or what have you. I wanted to make another point. In Jewish tradition, the whole idea of Bikur Cholim, which is visiting the sick, something we talked about. According to Jewish tradition, bringing comfort and healing, so important, goes all the way back to Abraham, the first Jew. And I was looking at it again in preparation for this episode, and Abraham was a pretty old guy when he took on a new religion called Judaism, and part of that was the requirement of circumcision. So it was a big surgery, right, at any age, but especially at his age. And then there's the juxtaposition of the visit of the three angels. So in Jewish Talmudic tradition, those angels represent God, and God Almighty visited Abraham as he was recovering from his surgery. Right. The rabbi said, just as God visited Abraham, therefore we are taught to visit those who are in need of healing by our love, our presence, our friendship. And that, to them, is the importance of visiting someone who is ill. Because especially as you think of the history of illness, people might be afraid to visit you because they don't want to catch what you have, or maybe they don't know what to say, or maybe it makes them uncomfortable. But when someone is really ill, it can be very isolating. And so it's so important to make sure that people in your circle know that they are not alone. Even if you meet them at where they are, the outpouring of love and care is part of that healing process, and part of what I call the extension of the healing service. It takes place in that powerful moment where 100 to 200 people gather, and part of the power of that service I talked about is you realize you are not alone in your suffering. And when you understand that, it takes away some of the why me, and it allows you again to be more open to the power of faith and healing itself. And this wasn't always the focus in Judaism. It really came to be in the 1990s until the current period of time, where these healing services And in our liturgy, we have what's called the Misha Berach, which means the one who blesses. And we take time to literally ask people to stand and say the name of loved ones who are ill with people's permission. And, just saying someone's name makes it more real. Now I have a couple loved ones who are ill, and so I always say their names. And I don't know, it just makes me feel more connected to them and them to me.
And, there's so many opportunities for us, I believe, today to express that care, to be present in someone's lives. The person who is ill, the person who's suffering, they may not want a personal visit, but through a text, an email,
a phone call,
a brief phone call. The thing I always love about the text is that it gives someone the permission to read it at their leisure. They may be exhausted and not able to take a phone call, but those were always the things that touched me the most, is just being able to go back and read those words over when I was very discouraged or when I was hurting. Yeah. And it does remind us that we're in it together, this journey called life.
Well, a lot for people to think about. And we hope that these last two episodes give people an opportunity to reflect upon their lives, because part of the human experience is, our sense of fragility. But if we're lucky, we will realize that we're not alone. We have God to carry us, and we have our friends, our family, our colleagues, and co-workers who can be there to lend a sense of support. If we open our hearts to them, they'll open their hearts to us.
There's something I do want to add, and that is this, that we may never, and seldom do we, or we may never understand the why. We may never be given a question. And so the challenge for us is to remember the goodness of God. And so for me personally, I always go back to the book of Lamentations, right? Here is this letter written to us about pain, about suffering, about tears. And yet in the midst of that, there's this most poignant passage which says, the steadfast love of the Lord never ceases. His mercies never come to an end. They are new every morning. I find great hope in that, and that as a person of faith, the challenge for me is to remember that, to realize we may never be given the answer, but also to realize that you in your life may be an instrument of that mercy, of that blessing.
I think those are wise words to conclude this podcast. And I thank you for that. And thank you, gentle listeners, to tuning into this episode of Faith Matters, because for us, faith does matter, and it gives us strength in times of need, but also enhances times of great joy. So thank you again for tuning into this latest episode of Faith Matters. Shalom.
Shalom.
Faith Matters features Rabbi Sanford Akselrad from Congregation Year Tamid and Reverend Adrian from Green Valley Presbyterian Church, and is produced by Leslie Snadowsky. We hope you join us again for our next podcast episode of Faith Matters.